Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic Item Reviews and General Musical Meanderings. We're at the penultimate episode 11 of 12 of my Tier 1 listening series for 2023. I'm using these albums to kind of set the standard going forward. It's kind of like a control group. And I'm going to put these in brackets at the end of this next week and use them to compare and contrast for all the listening I'm doing throughout the rest of this year. You may actually see one of these albums as Album of the Year for 2023. You don't know unless we get started. So next one I got up is Gruff Rhys's Seeking New Gods. Gruff Rhys is the lead singer for Super Furry Animals, and this is one of his solo projects. And Gruff Rhys recorded this album during a stint in the Mojave Desert, but it was inspired by a volcano, Mount Paektu, in Eastern Asia. And all the songs in here are sort of a self-created mythology kind of surrounding this mountain that he sort of came up with. And that in and of itself makes this a pretty interesting concept album. And stylistically, it's kind of a feel-good indie rock pop album, but the sort of philosophical underpinnings of this album and its kind of vulnerable nature make this an album that has a feel-good surface, but I'll definitely have some deeper underpinnings.
Eventually crumble. Heavenly fires will active its signs. Drunk thunder shatters the stratosphere. Out of the blizzard comes peace. Carry on, can you carry on? Carry on, can you carry that on?
Gruff Rhys's vocal approach is very kind of unassuming, and it feels almost like an introverted musical delivery. It feels kind of self-encapsulated, but at the same time, musically, it's very extroverted. It's got a lot of melodic material. It's very broad and has that kind of windswept feel to it that was attractive. And once I started getting into it and getting a feel for, especially for Gruff Rhys's voice, I really fell in love with it. And it's just shot through with layer upon layer of hooks and melodies that really hold the whole thing together. Okay, next up I got Paul Chambers, Bass on Top. This 1957 album is from Paul Chambers, legendary bass player, kind of the will call guy back in that time for John Coltrane and Miles Davis, played on innumerable albums, but only a few albums that he appeared as the band leader. This is one of the 3 albums that was the case. And I think the argument can be made that Paul Chambers might be to the stand-up bass to what like Jacques Pastorius was to the electric bass. His voice and his specific way of playing the instrument was incalculably influential. And especially on this recording, you can hear the breadth of his playing, because in addition to playing bass in a way that's very, jazz bass in a very standard way with plucking style, he uses a lot of arco on this album, a lot of bowing, which in some ways, if you will, kind of gives this a chamber feel. That style of playing is more associated with classical playing, but he's really able to access a different voice on the instrument using that technique that a lot of bass players don't really use the same way. I think there's some specific issues that you have to deal with as a stand-up bass player, specifically as a band leader, because the bass is a pretty unassuming instrument. It tends to sit in the background, so much so that whenever you play a bass solo, the whole band just kind of shuts down except for the hi-hat, just to make space so the instrument can be heard. And the kind of things that you do to play an impressive bass solo is just not the same kind of things. You can't wail on a bass like you can on a saxophone or a trumpet. To do things impressive on a bass, you really have to play super tastefully and creatively, and that's something that Paul Chambers does all over this album. Okay, next up I got Tyler, the Creator's Igor. Tyler, the Creator, had made several albums before this album had come out and had kind of gone from being a kind of a horrorcore rapper to a guy with a lot broader palette than certainly initially that he had. I think that Tyler, the Creator, is really trying to head toward the kind of R&B pop crossover that Frank Ocean had really mined so well, like on Channel Orange. And although Tyler, the Creator, is definitely not the singer that Frank Ocean is, he definitely, I think, has that kind of creative bent to his music. And on this album in particular, he's kind of riding around a concept, which is also kind of an attractive idea to me personally. It's a weird love triangle thing between him and another guy and a girl, and how there's sort of this breakup thing that's happening. He's kind of vying for the attention. All the songs are sort of revolving around this concept.
It's my fault. Don't leave, it's my fault. 'Cause when it all comes crashing down, I need you. 'Cause you make my earthquake. Oh, you make my earthquake. You ride me round and down some pain.
Kind of still look at the way that he approaches the singing in this album as vulnerable, which really fits the topics that are conveyed on the album. You can almost see it as kind of minimalist R&B, because on one level of Igor, you've got very kind of grimy, buzzy keyboard synthesizer sounds. But on the other hand, you have this very well-developed production. So it feels like those choices are very intentional, where he has kind of more lo-fi side to the album, but it's underpinned by more contemporary productions. Pretty smart way to approach it. And I think that kind of creativity is one of the strengths of Igor. And finally, I got Air's 10,000 Hertz Legend. This album has been on my Amazon wish list for probably 2 decades at this point. And I initially put it on there not because I'm a huge Air fan, but because there's sort of the Jellyfish Beck brain trust plays a role in this album. You got Roger Joseph Manning Jr. is on here, Jason Faulkner's on here, and of course Beck himself is on this album. They play guest appearances and do some co-writing. And anytime you've got members of Jellyfish involved, I'm interested, and especially collaborations between Jason Faulkner and Robert Joseph Manning Jr. are always points of interest. And it's particularly interesting because during this time for Robert Joseph Manning Jr. and Jason Faulkner, they're also kind of involved in the Logan Sanctuary soundtrack and the Mode Cookbook, and that's the kind of stuff that Air is really working with here. They are fans of vintage synthesizers, and they really use those very effectively to create a broad variety of textures and sounds on 10,000 Hertz Legend.
If you need some fun, some good stereo gun, radio #1. Brand new ears at once, eject musical trash. Radio #1.
Now, upon unboxing this album, it turns out that Jason Faulkner and Roger Joseph Manning Jr. really only have one song they collaborate on, which is Radio #1. And it's a great song. There's some weird mixing things happening in there with Jason Faulkner's voice kind of popping out and popping back out of the mix. But overall, so it's pretty creative. Certainly feels like it gets to land right in the middle of David Bowie's Low and not be out of place. And I think that kind of quality in this album on 10,000 Hertz Legend is present pretty much for the first maybe third or half of the album. But then it drops off pretty quickly. It gets into some kind of weird psychedelic stuff. And by the end, I think the trip kind of goes bad. As a matter of fact, it really jumps the shark when you get into like Wonder Milky Bitch and songs like that. I don't know that I can really advocate for those songs as strongly, but the front end of this album has some really great creative stuff. And say you're a playlist builder, then there's certainly some tracks on this I think that would be worth adding to your playlist for sure. Okay, that's all I got for you guys this time around. If you like the video, of course, please like and subscribe. Share it with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I've got all these tracks going up on a 2023 playlist. You can check them out at your leisure. Also, I've got a Patreon page going. It's not too late. Please jump on board if you want to subscribe to this year's viewers bracket. It's still open. Please get involved if you can. One more episode coming up, and until I see you then, I'll catch you on the flip side.